While a 6-year-old girl today starts kindergarten, in 1396, 6-year-old Isabella de Valois was become the queen of an empire. Instead of a toy doll in her hands, she held a golden crown. But no one had told her what the price would be. After hearing this story, you'll understand once again how precious childhood truly is. Because this is the story of one of politics' most innocent victims. The story of how a child was sacrificed for peace, and how it turned into a tragedy. The world Isabella de Valois was born into was very different from ours. When she was born on November 9th, 1389, at the Louvre Palace, her father Charles VI was not just the King of France, but also a man known as Charles the Mad, a king who suffered from episodes where he believed he was made of glass and refused to bathe for months. Picture little Isabella's childhood. One day her father bounces her on his knee, showering her with gifts and attention. The next, she finds him cowering in a corner, screaming that assassins are coming to kill him, or standing motionless for hours, convinced that if he moved, his glass body would shatter into 1,000 pieces. Palace servants would hustle the children away during these episodes, but the fear and confusion lingered in young Isabella's eyes. Her mother, Isabella of Bavaria, was a formidable woman trying to hold the kingdom together during her husband's periods of incapacity. Beautiful and intelligent, she understood better than most that her children were valuable assets in the complex web of European politics. She watched her eldest daughter with calculating eyes, knowing that Isabella's beauty and royal blood would one day secure a crucial alliance for France. The world Isabella was born into was one of almost constant warfare. For nearly 60 years, England and France had been locked in what we now call the 100 Years' War. French villages lay in ruins from English raids. English nobles had spent their fortunes financing campaigns across the Channel. Both kingdoms were exhausted, their treasuries depleted, their people weary of war. By the 1390s, there were whispers in both courts of peace. But peace required more than just words. It required bonds that could not easily be broken. This is where 6-year-old Isabella entered the grand theater of European politics. The idea of marrying Isabella to Richard II first emerged during secret negotiations between French and English ambassadors in 1395. Richard had been devastated by the death of his beloved first wife, Anne of Bohemia, the previous year, and had been known as Good Queen and adored by the English people for her gentleness and charity. Her death from plague had left Richard not only grief-stricken, but also without an heir, a dangerous situation for any medieval monarch. Richard's advisors urged him to remarry quickly, but the English king was initially resistant. His marriage to and had been one of genuine affection, rare among royal unions. The thought of replacing her felt like a betrayal of her memory, but duty to the realm ultimately outweighed personal sentiment. And when French ambassadors arrived with a proposal that could end the war, Richard began to listen. The French proposition was audacious in its scope. They offered not just a hand to the king's eldest daughter, but a dowry of 800,000 francs, an astronomical sum that would go far toward refilling England's war-depleted treasury. More importantly, they offered a 28-year truce, long enough for an entire generation to grow up without knowing war. There was one significant obstacle. Isabella was only 6 years old. Even by medieval standards, this was unusually young for a royal bride. Most political marriages involved girls who were at least approaching adolescence. But the French negotiators argued that this very youth was an advantage. The marriage would symbolize a new beginning, unsullied by the hatred and blood that had characterized relations between the two kingdoms. Isabella would be raised at the English court, learning English customs and loyalties. By the time she was old enough to rule as queen consort, she would be as much English as French. Richard's counselors were divided. Some saw the wisdom in the proposal. The dowry alone would fund the royal household for years. An extended truce would allow England to focus on other threats. But Richard himself was intrigued by something else entirely. Court observers noted that when he saw the miniature portrait of Isabella sent by the French ambassadors, something in his expression softened. Here was a child who would need protection, guidance, and care. Perhaps, some whispered, the childless king saw in this arrangement not just a political alliance, but the opportunity to be a father as well as a husband. Meanwhile, in Paris, 6-year-old Isabella played with her dolls, unaware that her fate was being decided in council chambers and written into documents sealed with wax and ribbon. Her tutors began teaching her English phrases, and seamstresses started work on a trousseau fit for a queen. She was told she was going to marry a great king across the water. But at 6, the concept was no more real to her than the fairy tales her nurses told at bedtime. The wedding ceremony took place not once, but twice, reflecting the diplomatic complexity of the union. The first ceremony was intimate, attended primarily by negotiators and high-ranking nobles from both kingdoms. Standing in the great hall, Isabella must have been overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment. She wore a gown of cloth of gold, so heavy with embroidery and pearls that she needed help walking. Her new husband knelt to her level to exchange rings, and witnesses noted how gently he lifted her chin when she seemed frightened by the assembled nobles staring at her. A year later, she was crowned queen in Westminster Abbey. The English people had heard tales of their new child queen, and curiosity drew massive crowds to London for the coronation. Isabella processed through London streets in a litter decorated with English roses and French fleur-de-lis, symbolizing the union of the two kingdoms. She wore a crown specially made for her small head, and her train was carried by English duchesses who had been chosen to serve as her guardians and teachers. The crowds that lined the streets called out blessings in English, which she was only beginning to understand. The coronation feast that followed lasted 3 days, with entertainment that included jugglers, musicians, and elaborate theatrical presentations. Isabella sat at the high table beside Richard, picking at her food with the careful manners her French tutors had drilled into her, while nobles toasted the health of the child queen. Richard installed her in her own apartments at Westminster Palace, staffed with a carefully chosen household that blended French and English attendants. Her days were filled with lessons, not just in languages and courtly accomplishments, but in the complex etiquette of English court life. She learned to curtsy in the English fashion, to speak English with the accent of the court rather than her French tutors. Richard himself took an active interest in her education and welfare. Contemporary chronicles describe him visiting her apartments regularly, bringing her gifts from across his realm, exotic birds from Ireland, fine books from Oxford, musical instruments crafted by London's best artisans. He seemed to genuinely enjoy her company, and she began to look forward to his visits, greeting him with a mixture of formality and affection that marked their unusual relationship. The other children at court quickly accepted Isabella as one of their own. Her favorite companion was Margaret Holland, daughter of one of Richard's half-brothers. Margaret was only 2 years older than Isabella, but seemed worldly and sophisticated to the young queen. It was Margaret who taught Isabella English children's games, who helped her understand which ladies-in-waiting could be trusted with secrets. But even as Isabella seemed to be adapting to her new life, the political situation that had created her marriage was becoming increasingly unstable. By 1399, Richard was facing the greatest crisis of his reign. His cousin Henry Bolingbroke, whom Richard had exiled the previous year, had returned to England with an army. The first signs of trouble came when Isabella noticed changes in the atmosphere at court. Conversation stopped more abruptly when she appeared. Her ladies-in-waiting exchanged worried glances. Even Margaret Holland seemed distracted and anxious. Richard himself seemed different. His visits became less frequent, and when he did come, he appeared preoccupied. Isabella first realized the severity of the situation when she woke one morning to find that several of her English ladies-in-waiting had disappeared during the night. Margaret Holland burst into Isabella's chambers that evening, her face pale with fear. "You must pack immediately," she whispered urgently. "We're leaving Westminster tonight." The journey through London's dark streets was unlike anything in Isabella's previous experience. Instead of ceremonial processions, they traveled in a small, heavily guarded convoy. At the Tower of London, Isabella was installed in apartments that were comfortable but clearly designed to contain rather than simply house their occupant. Richard came to see her on her second day at the Tower, and the change in him was shocking. The confident, kindly king she had known was gone, replaced by a man who seemed to have aged years in a matter of weeks. "My dear child," he said, kneeling before her chair, "I'm afraid our circumstances have become difficult." This was Isabella's first real lesson in the brutal arithmetic of medieval politics. Her value as a person was secondary to her value as a symbol and diplomatic asset. The love and care Richard had shown her, genuine though it may have been, could not shield her from the larger forces that were reshaping the English kingdom. When Henry Bolingbroke finally came to meet her, now calling himself Henry IV of England, Isabella rose from her chair and curtsied deeply. Henry studied her for a long moment, taking in her poise and obvious intelligence. "What has become of the king?" Isabella asked, referring to Richard with directness that had become her hallmark. "Richard of Bordeaux is no longer king," Henry replied, using Richard's birth name rather than his royal title. "He has abdicated in favor of my claim to the throne." Isabella knew enough about politics to understand that abdicated likely meant was forced to give up the crown. What followed were weeks of agonizing uncertainty. Isabella could hear the sounds of the city beyond the tower walls, but she was cut off from reliable news. When word reached her that Richard had died in captivity, the news hit her with unexpected force. She had never loved Richard as a wife loves a husband. How could she, when she was still a child? But he had been kind to her, had protected her, had been the closest thing to a father figure she had known since leaving France. In early 1400, Isabella received an ultimatum from Henry's government. She would be allowed to return to France, but only if she formally acknowledged Henry as the rightful king of England and renounced any claims she might have to the English throne as Richard's widow. For Isabella, the choice was stark. Accept exile and acknowledge that her 3 years as Queen of England had been meaningless, or refuse and risk remaining a prisoner indefinitely. The decision was made for her by events beyond her control. Charles VI, during one of his lucid periods, sent word that he expected his daughter to return to France immediately. Faced with the prospect of renewed war with France, Henry's government quickly agreed to Isabella's departure. The journey back to France in the summer of 1401 was bittersweet. She was leaving behind the only home she had known for 5 years, but she was also returning to a family and country that had become foreign to her during her years in England. She now spoke French with a slight English accent and had to relearn the etiquette of her father's court. The reunion with her parents was complicated by her father's deteriorating mental condition. When he finally emerged from his madness several weeks later, he seemed confused by Isabella's presence, as if he had forgotten that she had been married to the English king. Her mother was more welcoming, but also more calculating, immediately considering how Isabella's unique position might be used to advance French interests. Isabella found herself caught between competing demands on her loyalty and knowledge. When her mother's advisors questioned her about English defenses or Henry's support among the nobility, she answered carefully, providing general information while avoiding details that might be used to plan military campaigns. Her status as a former Queen of England made her an attractive marriage prospect, but it also complicated any potential matches. Some suitors were intimidated by her royal rank and political significance. Others were more interested in the political advantages of marrying her than in Isabella herself. Isabella, for her part, had developed strong opinions about marriage based on her experiences with Richard. She had seen how political marriages could provide protection and stability, but she had also witnessed how quickly such arrangements could collapse when circumstances changed. The negotiations for her second marriage took place against a backdrop of continuing chaos in England and growing French confidence. When Isabella first met with Charles of Orleans to discuss marriage seriously, she was struck by how different he was from Richard. Where Richard had been gentle and somewhat otherworldly, Charles was passionate and intensely engaged with the world around him. "I want you to understand," he told her during one of their private conversations, "that I am not seeking to marry the former Queen of England. I am seeking to marry Isabella de Valois, the remarkable young woman who survived the courts of 2 kingdoms and emerged with her dignity intact." Isabella found herself genuinely attracted to Charles in a way she had never experienced before. At 14, she was no longer a child, and the feelings stirred within her were those of a young woman discovering her own desires and preferences. The marriage took place in June 1406 at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. Isabella, now 16, wore a gown of deep blue silk embroidered with golden fleur-de-lis. She walked down the aisle with confidence, no longer the frightened child who had been married to a stranger, but a young woman choosing her own path. The early years of Isabella's marriage to Charles were among the happiest of her life. Charles proved to be not only a devoted husband, but also an intellectual companion who shared her interests in literature, music, and the arts. Isabella threw herself into her new role with enthusiasm, patronizing troubadours and commissioning illuminated manuscripts. The couple's first child, a daughter named Jean, was born in 1407. Isabella approached motherhood with the same intensity she brought to everything else, determined to be a more present parent than her own mother had been. Holding her daughter for the first time, Isabella felt a profound sense of completion. But even as Isabella enjoyed domestic happiness, the larger world continued to intrude. The rivalry between the Orleans and Burgundian factions would eventually tear France apart, and Isabella's comfortable neutrality became impossible to maintain when Louis of Orleans was assassinated in November 1407 by agents of the Duke of Burgundy. The assassination transformed Isabella's life overnight. Charles, who had inherited his father's titles and responsibilities, was now one of the most powerful men in France, but he was also a marked man. Isabella found herself thrust into a world of bodyguards and constant vigilance. The birth of Isabella's second child, a son named Charles in 1408, provided brief respite from political tensions. But the physical and emotional toll of her years of suffering could not be undone. Isabella remained a deeply anxious, depressed woman who found little joy even in her eventual success as a mother. Her later years were marked by increasing physical problems and what court doctors described as melancholy attacks. Modern analysis of her symptoms suggests she suffered from anxiety disorders and depression that ran in Habsburg bloodlines, conditions exacerbated by the trauma of her early marriage experiences. Isabella de Valois died on September 13, 1409, at the age of 20. She had lived a life that spanned 3 kingdoms and 2 marriages, experiencing both the heights of royal power and the depths of political uncertainty. Her death was mourned throughout Europe, not just by her family and subjects, but by the many people whose lives she had touched through her kindness and wisdom. Her legacy is not the political success that history books celebrate, but the human cost of a system that treated women as breeding stock and ignored the genetic consequences of dynastic marriages. Isabella was both perpetrator and victim of a system that concentrated too much power in the hands of individuals who were fundamentally unprepared to wield it. The 6-year-old girl who once stood trembling in Westminster Abbey, crowned with crown too heavy for her small head, had become a woman who understood the true cost of power. Her story reminds us that behind every historical narrative of imperial grandeur, there are individual human stories of suffering and survival that deserve our attention and compassion, even across the vast gulf of 600 years.